He wasn't like anybody else. He wasn't like anybody I'd ever met. It was the specificity of him and his sort of humanity and his curiosity about people, his compassion.
Behind the 3 Oscars, the record 21 nominations, and more than 5 decades of performances stands a woman whose life has been marked by losses Hollywood could never turn into a movie. The sudden death of the man she loved before her career had even begun. Humiliations that followed her into an industry obsessed with beauty. Brutal criticism that questioned whether she could truly feel. Uncomfortable moments on film sets. Controversies that dragged her into Hollywood's darkest scandals. And a 45-year marriage that quietly changed while the world was still watching her as if everything were perfect. At 77, the tragedy of Meryl Streep is beyond heartbreaking. But to make sense of it all, we need to start from the very beginning. The woman Hollywood almost didn't want. But before the awards, before Sophie's Choice, The Devil Wears Prada, and The Iron Lady, there was a much less flattering question hanging over Meryl Streep's career. Did Hollywood even want her? The answer, at first, was far from certain. Meryl was born Mary Louise Streep on June 22, 1949, in Summit, New Jersey. She graduated cum laude from Vassar College in 1971, earned an MFA with honors from Yale School of Drama, and moved into New York theater. But Yale was not the effortless launchpad that later biographies can make it seem. Streep entered the Yale School of Drama in the early 1970s and found herself in an environment she later described as almost brutally demanding. She was repeatedly pulled from classes to perform at Yale Repertory Theater, eventually taking on around 40 roles under a dozen different directors. The pressure became physical. She developed an ulcer. One acting teacher even placed her on probation because he believed she was holding herself back, possibly because she was afraid of overshadowing her fellow students. Years later, Streep remembered the experience bluntly. Drama school, in her words, was like boot camp, and she said it was the first time she realized acting had a dark side. This irony would follow her for the rest of her life. Yet Yale was also where the qualities that would eventually make Streep extraordinary began becoming impossible to ignore. She wasn't simply being trained to perform. She played radically different characters, experimented with voices and physicality, and developed the versatility that would later become her trademark. After graduating, she plunged into New York theater, appearing in 7 off-Broadway productions during her first year. In 1975, she made her Broadway debut in Trelawney of the Wells. It should have been a triumph. But then, something went wrong. The judgment of a single person changed the atmosphere around the aspiring actor almost overnight. The critic was John Simon, one of New York theater's most feared reviewers. Streep later recalled that audiences had laughed and enjoyed the play during previews. But after Simon published a harsh review, she noticed a striking change. The audience seemed to become more restrained, almost as though they had been told in advance how they were supposed to feel. She remembered the anxiety of waking up and buying newspapers to see what the few critics who mattered had written. The experience left such an impression that she later said it was when she began to hate critics. Then came an even more brutal test. In 1975, while she was still largely unknown, Streep was invited to audition for Dino De Laurentiis' remake of King Kong. De Laurentiis' son, Federico, had seen her work and thought she might be right for the role. But when the young actress entered Dino's office, she heard the producer speak to his son in Italian. According to Streep's own later recollection, he asked, "Why did you bring me this ugly thing?" What he apparently didn't know was that Streep understood Italian. She answered him in the same language, telling him that she understood what he had said and was sorry she wasn't beautiful enough to be in King Kong. The role went to Jessica Lange. The story became even more distorted years later when a photograph of Streep riding the New York subway began circulating online with a supposedly inspirational caption, claiming it showed her returning home immediately after the rejection. It didn't. The photograph was taken in 1981, years after the King Kong audition and after Streep had already become an Oscar-winning actress. The viral caption was not written by Streep either. The humiliation itself, however, was very real. And that is what makes the beginning of her story so striking. But the woman Hollywood had nearly dismissed was also standing at the edge of something far more painful. The love that ended before her career had even begun. In 1976, Meryl Streep met John Cazale while they were appearing together in a New York production of Measure for Measure. Cazale was 41 and already revered within the acting world for performances that had made him unforgettable. Fredo Corleone in The Godfather and The Godfather, Part 2, and Sal in Dog Day Afternoon. Streep was 26, newly out of Yale and still trying to establish herself. They were an unlikely pair, but the relationship became serious quickly. They lived together, and Cazale became not only her partner, but one of the people from whom she learned most about acting. Then the future they were building together was suddenly interrupted by Cazale's cancer diagnosis. When Michael Cimino's The Deer Hunter was being assembled, Cazale was cast as Stan. This would be his final film role. The studio wanted him replaced after learning how sick he was, but Cimino pushed ahead, arranging for Cazale's scenes to be filmed first. The director later recalled that the production concealed the seriousness of Cazale's illness from the studio. For Streep, The Deer Hunter therefore became something much more complicated than the small supporting role that would eventually introduce her to a huge movie audience. Her boyfriend was dying while they were working on a film about men whose lives are destroyed by war. She joined the production partly because it allowed her to remain close to him. The circumstances were almost unbearably stark. Robert De Niro, Christopher Walken, John Savage, Cazale, and Streep were making a film that would become one of the defining American movies about Vietnam, while off-camera Streep was watching the man she loved deteriorate. Here was a young actress simultaneously grieving, working, and trying to build a career that had barely begun. There was another reason the experience mattered professionally. Streep's role as Linda was not enormous, but she gave the character an emotional center amid a cast dominated by male actors and an intensely masculine story. Cazale, meanwhile, was completing what would become only his fifth feature film performance. That is one of the strangest facts about his legacy. Despite appearing in only 5 films, everyone became historically significant. The first 2 Godfather films, Dog Day Afternoon, The Conversation, and The Deer Hunter, form an almost absurdly influential filmography. Al Pacino later described Cazale as an acting partner and an older brother, while Streep remembered how obsessively he approached the work, but the film could not outrun reality. On March 12, 1978, Cazale died in New York. He was 42. The Deer Hunter had not yet premiered. Streep was at his bedside when the man she had loved for nearly 2 years died, and she was only 29 years old. And then life moved with a speed that can look almost cruel in retrospect. Within weeks of Cazale's death, Streep's living situation became unstable. An ex-girlfriend obtained the lease on his apartment, forcing Streep to find somewhere else to stay. Her brother helped her pack, and through him she reconnected with a sculptor named Don Gummer, whom she had met only briefly before. Gummer offered her the use of his apartment while he was away. What began as practical kindness became something else. In September of that same year, only months after Cazale's death, Streep and Gummer married. That transition is one of the most emotionally complicated parts of Streep's early biography. She was grieving while simultaneously confronting the practical necessity of continuing her life. And almost immediately, another door opened. She was offered the role of Joanna Kramer in Kramer vs. Kramer, the film that would transform her from a respected young actress into an Oscar winner. 1978 thus became the year that contained both the deepest personal loss of her young life and the beginning of her transformation into a Hollywood star. The career she would spend the next half-century building was already beginning, while her old life was disappearing, but the costs were never reasonable. When the performance became personal. Still grieving John Cazale, Streep fought to make Joanna Kramer more than a villain. rewriting her crucial courtroom speech to give the character greater complexity. But on the set, the line between acting and real life was about to become disturbingly thin. During one scene, Hoffman slapped Streep across the face without warning. The slap left a visible red mark. Streep still performed the scene, but the incident became one of the most controversial episodes in the production's history. Years later, she described that kind of behavior as overstepping. The important distinction is that this was not some mysterious piece of Hollywood folklore. The incident has been recounted in detailed accounts of the production, including recollections from people who were there. Hoffman was pursuing a highly confrontational approach to performance, but Streep did not need to be physically struck to understand Joanna's distress. And then came something even more unsettling. According to producer Richard Fishoff's recollections, Hoffman deliberately invoked John Cazale's name and cancer during filming in an attempt to provoke an emotional reaction from Streep. Streep went white. She had spent months trying to process an enormous personal loss, and someone on the set was deliberately reaching into that wound because it might produce a more convincing performance. Streep herself later explained that she had not simply gotten over Cazale's death. The pain remained with her, she said, but she had learned to carry it without allowing it to consume her. Streep's rewrite of Joanna's courtroom speech gave the character an argument about a woman's right to have ambitions and a life of her own. Hoffman pushed back against her interventions, telling her to stop carrying the flag for feminism and simply act the scene. But Benton ultimately accepted Streep's changes. That confrontation became significant because Joanna's courtroom testimony is where the film finally gives the abandoned mother a chance to explain herself. The movie could have remained almost entirely Ted Kramer's story. Streep fought to make sure Joanna had a story of her own. The irony is that the film, born from so much tension, became a spectacular triumph. Kramer vs. Kramer was released in 1979 and became one of the year's biggest critical and awards successes. It won 5 major Academy Awards, including Best Picture, Best Director for Robert Benton, Best Actor for Dustin Hoffman, and Best Supporting Actress for Streep. For Streep, it was her first Oscar, but a pattern was already forming, and it would define her for the rest of her career. Almost immediately, Streep moved into another role built around catastrophic loss. In Sophie's Choice, released in 1982, she played Sophie Zawistowski, a Polish survivor of Auschwitz, forced to confront the devastating consequences of a decision made inside the concentration camp. Streep repeatedly chose characters whose private wounds were central to their identities. Abandoned mothers, survivors, women trapped between duty and freedom, people carrying guilt they could not escape. Her greatest early breakthroughs arrived through stories about grief, motherhood, abandonment, guilt, and survival, just as her own life had suddenly been reshaped by the death of John Cazale. Hollywood was asking her to perform pain. Streep's extraordinary achievement was learning how to transform it into something audiences could recognize without ever needing to know exactly where the actress ended and the character began. The actress who was accused of having no heart. For years, Meryl Streep was hailed as one of the most technically gifted actresses of her generation. Yet some critics wondered whether there was actually a human being underneath all that precision. Pauline Kael, the famously influential New Yorker critic, delivered the most memorable attack, arguing that Streep acted from the neck up. The phrase followed her for years. Streep later admitted that Kael's judgment killed her, and the criticism did not exist only in the press. Streep herself recalled that John Cazale, the actor she loved before his death,
Meryl and John experienced a connection to one another that was as intense as it was instant, and the world dissolved around them. But what was happening between Meryl and John was unlike anything before it.
had once called her a delicious robot. His meaning, according to Streep, was not that she lacked talent, quite the opposite. He thought she could execute a performance almost perfectly, while somehow keeping her deepest feelings protected from the camera. The accusation became harder to sustain as Streep's filmography expanded. In Out of Africa, she played Karen Blixen, a woman caught between love, independence, and the collapse of an entire life she had built in Kenya. In A Cry in the Dark, she portrayed Lindy Chamberlain, the Australian mother whose infant daughter disappeared and whose subsequent murder conviction became one of Australia's most notorious miscarriages of justice. Then came Postcards from the Edge, where Streep played an actress battling addiction and the complicated shadow of her famous mother. None of these performances simply required technical imitation. Each depended on characters whose emotions were deliberately restrained, conflicted, or difficult to read. Then came The Bridges of Madison County in 1995, and something changed. As Francesca Johnson, an Iowa housewife who finds herself falling in love with a visiting photographer played by Clint Eastwood, Streep had almost nowhere to hide. There are no extravagant costumes, no historical transformation, and no grand speech designed to win an audience. The drama rests on hesitation, the glance held too long, the decision not made, the life that might have been. The performance became one of the clearest answers to the neck-up criticism because its power came precisely from what Francesca could not openly say. Even critics who had previously found Streep overly cerebral had to confront an actress capable of making silence feel devastating. But instead of settling into that discovery, Streep began doing something even more dangerous, refusing to become predictable. In The Devil Wears Prada, she transformed into Miranda Priestley, a terrifyingly controlled fashion editor whose smallest expressions could dominate a room. Then, almost absurdly, she followed it with Mamma Mia, singing and dancing as Donna Sheridan. The contrast was so extreme that even the old Pauline Kael criticism suddenly looked dated. At 59, Streep was demonstrating precisely the physical spontaneity Kael had claimed was missing. When the subject was raised with her, Streep herself connected the performance to the old criticism and acknowledged that she remained unable to forget what Kael had written. Then came Julia Child in Julie and Julia, another transformation that depended on far more than technical mimicry. Streep captured Child's distinctive voice, physical mannerisms, and exuberant personality while turning a towering culinary figure into an unexpectedly vulnerable human being. And in The Iron Lady, she went in the opposite direction again. As Margaret Thatcher, Streep constructed two versions of the same woman, the formidable political leader of the 1970s and 80s, and the elderly Thatcher, looking backward on the life she had built. The transformation earned Streep her third Academy Award for Best Actress. Yet even this triumph contained a controversy that complicated the victory. This time, the argument concerned the movie itself. Thatcher's former private secretary, Cynthia Crawford, called the domestic scenes absolutely inconceivable and argued that the film devoted disproportionate attention to dementia rather than Thatcher's political career. Thatcher biographer John Campbell, whose work helped inform the film, similarly criticized its historical simplification, arguing that it exaggerated Thatcher's individual importance while diminishing figures such as Foreign Secretary Geoffrey Howe. Conservative politicians also objected to the depiction of Thatcher as old, fragile, and cognitively impaired. And that is where Streep's supposed lack of emotion becomes almost ironic. She had spent decades being told that she was too controlled, too cerebral, too technically perfect. Yet her career increasingly demonstrated that control itself could become emotional power. She could make a woman whispering across a kitchen feel more devastating than another actress screaming. She could play a romantic heroine, a rock singer, a fashion tyrant, a beloved cook, and a controversial prime minister without allowing any one identity to swallow the others. The criticism never completely disappeared, but Streep stopped answering it with arguments. She answered it with range. By the time The Iron Lady earned her that third Oscar, the old accusation had effectively become part of the mythology, but it got more complicated from here. When the Hollywood system turned on her. What happens when an actress who has spent decades speaking publicly about women suddenly finds herself staring back from photographs beside one of Hollywood's most notorious predators? That was the uncomfortable question that confronted Meryl Streep in 2017, when the Harvey Weinstein scandal exploded and old photographs of the producer standing beside some of the biggest names in the industry suddenly acquired a completely different meaning. Streep had worked with Weinstein on films including The Iron Lady, which he distributed through the Weinstein Company. She had also publicly praised him in the past, including jokingly referring to him as God at the Golden Globes.
I just want to thank my agent, Kevin Uvain, and God, Harvey Weinstein, the Punisher, Old Testament, I guess.
Then came the revelations. Women were accusing Weinstein of harassment and assault. Then there was the system that had protected his power for decades was suddenly being exposed. Streep's response was immediate and unequivocal. She called Weinstein's behavior disgraceful and inexcusable and praised the women who had come forward. But then came the question that would follow her. How could someone as prominent as Streep have worked closely with Weinstein without knowing what was happening? Streep insisted that she genuinely had not known about his misconduct or the settlements that had concealed allegations. She argued that Weinstein had deliberately separated the people around him from the worst of his behavior, saying in one statement that he made sure I didn't know. Then Rose McGowan entered the confrontation. McGowan, one of Weinstein's accusers, attacked Streep publicly over plans for prominent actresses to wear black at the upcoming Golden Globes as a protest against misconduct. McGowan argued that actresses who had worked with Weinstein were being hypocritical if they protested publicly while remaining silent about the producer. Then, in December of 2017, posters suddenly appeared around the city showing Streep beside Weinstein with a red bar covering her eyes and the words, "She knew." They appeared near the Screen Actors Guild headquarters, near Streep's Pasadena home, and around Hollywood locations connected to her work. The imagery was designed to make an accusation look like a verdict, but there was an extraordinary detail behind the campaign. The artist responsible, Sabo, eventually acknowledged that he did not actually know whether Streep had known about Weinstein's misconduct. He said he was retaliating against Streep for her criticism of President Donald Trump, and just when the Weinstein controversy was threatening to overwhelm her public image, an entirely different battle erupted over something far less consequential: a dress. Days before the 2017 Academy Awards, Chanel creative director Karl Lagerfeld told Women's Wear Daily that Streep had initially ordered a couture gown from Chanel, but abandoned it after finding another designer who would pay her to wear its clothes. Lagerfeld called her a genius actress, but added the insult, "Cheapness also? No." Streep's representatives immediately denied the allegation, saying she had never been paid to wear clothing and that accepting such payment was against her ethics. Then, Lagerfeld backed away. Chanel confirmed that discussions had taken place with Streep's stylist, but said the decision to choose another designer had not been explained as a matter of payment. Lagerfeld subsequently said he had misunderstood the situation and regretted the controversy. Streep, however, was furious. She said his remarks had overshadowed her record-breaking 20th Oscar nomination and accused him of defaming her and her stylist. She specifically rejected his explanation as insufficient. After all, the original allegation had already traveled around the world. And that may be the strangest part of Streep's later controversies. By this stage, she had become more than an actress. She had become a symbol of artistic excellence, feminism, political resistance, and Hollywood prestige. That made every association more dangerous. The political war and the private life no one saw. By January 2017, Meryl Streep was no longer merely a movie star whose performances were judged one film at a time. She had become a cultural authority whose words could dominate the news even when she was not talking about acting. That transformation became unmistakable at the Golden Globes, where Streep accepted the Cecil B. DeMille Award for Lifetime Achievement. She could have spent the evening recounting the roles that had made her famous, but instead, she used the stage to confront the political atmosphere surrounding Donald Trump, who was weeks away from becoming president. Her speech became one of the defining celebrity interventions of the post-election period. Streep never actually said Trump's name during the speech. Instead, she described what she called one performance that had stunned her during the previous year: Trump's imitation of New York Times reporter Sergei Kovaleski, who has arthrogryposis, a condition affecting the functioning of his joints. Streep argued that the moment disturbed her because it was not happening inside a movie. It was real life. Then she broadened the argument beyond Trump himself, warning that when powerful people publicly humiliate others, that behavior can filter into ordinary life. She connected the issue to the press as well, urging her fellow Hollywood figures to support journalists and the committee to protect journalists. The reaction was immediate. Trump initially told the New York Times that he had not watched the speech, while dismissing Streep's criticism as the kind of attack he expected from liberal people. Then came the response that would become inseparable from the story.
He sure is going to war with Hollywood's most celebrated actress. It starts Meryl Streep, one of the most overrated actresses in Hollywood, doesn't know me.
In a series of tweets, he called her one of the most overrated actresses in Hollywood and a Hillary flunky, referring to Streep's support for Hillary Clinton during the 2016 election. There was an important irony in Trump's attack. By that point, Streep's career had already accumulated a body of evidence that made the word overrated almost impossible to separate from the argument itself. She had been nominated for the Academy Award more times than any other actor, and she had already won twice before her third victory for the Iron Lady. The Academy's records confirm that she won Best Actress in 2012 for portraying British Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher. Her public reputation had been built over decades through roles as different as Sophie in Sophie's Choice, Francesca in The Bridges of Madison County, Miranda Priestley in The Devil Wears Prada, Julia Child in Julie and Julia, and Thatcher herself. Yet the Golden Globes speech revealed that the Meryl Streep audiences knew from the screen had acquired another identity. It was the identity of a political witness. Her argument at the Golden Globes was essentially that this was precisely why actors had a responsibility to speak. An actor's only job, she said, is to enter the lives of people who are different from us and let you feel what that feels like. She was defending empathy as part of the profession itself. It was an idea that connected directly to the reputation she had spent decades building, but it also exposed her to a new kind of scrutiny. Once an actor becomes a political voice, audiences no longer judge only the performance. They begin judging the person. And that was the part nobody in the Golden Globes audience could see. While Streep was standing before millions of viewers discussing power, humiliation, and public responsibility, her own private life had already entered a radically different period. For decades, the public had seen her marriage to sculptor Don Gummer as remarkably stable. They married in 1978, only months after the death of John Cazale, and eventually raised 4 children: Henry, Mamie, Grace, and Louisa. Their family was unusually protected from the machinery of celebrity culture. Streep became one of the most photographed women in entertainment, yet her marriage and children rarely became a public spectacle. At the Academy Awards in February 2012, for instance, when she won Best Actress for The Iron Lady, it was her 3rd Oscar. And after decades of nominations, the victory itself was a major career event. But in her acceptance speech, she quickly turned toward Gummer. She explained that she wanted to thank him before the orchestra could play her off, and then told him that everything she valued most in their life had been given to her by him. For the next several years, that public image remained largely intact. Then, in October 2023, came the revelation that changed how the previous decade looked in retrospect. A representative for Streep confirmed that she and Gummer had been separated for more than 6 years and were living apart. The representative emphasized that they would always care for each other, but had chosen separate lives. The statement contained no accusation, no explanation of a dramatic incident, and no allegation of betrayal. The timing was extraordinary. If the separation had begun more than 6 years before the October 2023 announcement, it placed the change around 2017, the same year Streep stood at the Golden Globes and publicly confronted Trump. There was no public courtroom confrontation comparable to some celebrity divorces, no televised accusation campaign, and no detailed memoir explaining the breakdown of their relationship. They simply maintained separate lives. Even after the revelation, public information about the reasons remained extremely limited. In an industry where private relationships can become commodities, their silence was itself unusual. The woman whose face had appeared on magazine covers for decades had managed to keep one of the most consequential developments in her personal life largely beyond public view. Then another storm arrived. The Weinstein scandal exploded in 2017. Streep rejected the suggestion that she had knowingly protected Weinstein, and importantly, no evidence established that she participated in his crimes or deliberately concealed them. What the controversy exposed was a more difficult question. How much could people within Hollywood reasonably have known, suspected, or chosen not to ask? The actress, once humiliated over her appearance, had become one of Hollywood's defining performers. The woman who lost John Cazale before her film career had fully begun, built a family, and a decades-long marriage. The performer, once criticized as overly technical, became celebrated for emotional depth, and the star, caught in the Weinstein controversy, was simultaneously being treated by millions as a moral authority. Even her political clash with Donald Trump could not change the fact that, beneath all the headlines, her greatest achievement remained her ability to disappear into other people. And the story did not end in retreat. Streep continued working well into her 70s. She endured genuine loss, professional humiliation, difficult experiences, public controversy, and profound changes in her private life. But she never disappeared beneath them. Well, that's it for now. Thanks for watching. Did you like this video? If you did, please consider liking, dropping a comment, and hitting the subscribe button so that you don't miss out on our new uploads. Also, don't miss this video you see on your screen right now. It's truly unbelievable.